For 31 years, Judge Harriet, no. For 31 years the courtroom had been the only place where Sylvester Crane felt like himself. Let me start over, the right way. For 11 years, Nathaniel Crane had not spoken a single word in public. Not in a courtroom. Not in a grocery store. Not even at his son's school play, where every other parent laughed and cheered and he sat in the back row with his hands folded in his lap, moving his lips around sounds that refused to come out. The doctor had a name for it. Severe psychogenic mutism. Triggered by acute trauma. But names didn't pay the electric bill or explain to a 7-year-old why his father couldn't say goodnight out loud. Nathaniel was 42 years old. He had once been one of the most respected labor attorneys in Shreveport, Louisiana. People used to joke that his closing arguments could make a jury forget which side they were supposed to be on. He had a voice like river water. Deep, unhurried, carrying things along without force. Colleagues said he never raised it, never needed to. Words simply did what he asked them to do. Then came the night on Route 9, and after that, nothing. The accident took his wife, Karen, and left Nathaniel with a fractured collarbone, a scar along his left jaw, and a silence so complete that for the first 3 months, his own mother thought he had gone deaf. He hadn't. He could hear everything. His son crying in the next room, the creak of the house settling, the sound of his own breathing growing slower and more deliberate each morning, as he talked himself through the act of simply getting up. He just couldn't push sound back out into the world. It was as though grief had reached inside him and turned something off, and no amount of therapy or medication or willpower had figured out how to turn it back on. He communicated by phone, texts only. He had his cases transferred, then quietly resigned. He sold the law practice at a loss because negotiating the terms would have required speaking, and he couldn't ask anyone else to do that for him, without feeling like he was disappearing entirely. What he had left was his son, Owen, and the name stops there, because Owen appears in the list he was not supposed to use. His son's name was Cody, 7 years old when the accident happened. 11 now, in 5th grade, with Karen's nose and Nathaniel's habit of going completely still when he was thinking hard about something. Cody had learned to read his father early. He knew that 2 taps on the shoulder meant hurry up. He knew that his father's phone was always in his left breast pocket. He knew that when Nathaniel pressed his lips together and looked slightly to the right, he was working out how to say something in text that wouldn't sound wrong. Cody was 11 and already fluent in a language that had no words. They lived in a narrow 2-bedroom house on Prescott Lane in a part of Shreveport that had been quietly declining since the paper mill closed. Nathaniel did contract legal work remotely, document review, mostly, things that required reading and writing and no phone calls. It paid enough. Not well, but enough, which was a different kind of enough than the one he'd had before, but he had stopped measuring. The house had a small front porch where Nathaniel sat most mornings with his coffee before Cody woke up. The street was still then. A dog somewhere. The sound of someone's sprinkler fighting a losing battle against Louisiana August. Those mornings were the closest thing he had to peace, because in the silence before the day started, his silence felt chosen instead of broken. He didn't go out much. Grocery pickup. The occasional school function where Cody's teacher, Miss Patterson, had long since stopped expecting him to introduce himself. The post office, where the woman behind the counter had a laminated card he'd made her in the 2nd year. I have a voice condition. I'll write what I need. She kept it under the register without ever making it a thing, which was the only reason he kept going in person instead of shipping everything from home. That was Nathaniel Crane's life. Quiet, functional, held together by routine and his son, and the particular discipline of a man who has decided that falling apart is simply not an available option. He was not looking for anything to change. The Tuesday it all shifted began the way most Tuesdays did. Badly. The contract work had dried up. The firm that had been sending him document review cases for 2 years had lost a major client and cut their support staff, which meant no cases for the foreseeable future. Nathaniel found out via email at 7:43 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table while Cody ate cereal across from him, and he set his phone face down on the table and sat very still for a long moment in the way he did when he was thinking. Cody looked up. Bad. Nathaniel tilted his hand side to side, so. Then he thought about it and changed the gesture to something more honest. A slow flat press downward. Cody nodded and went back to his cereal. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He had learned, somewhere around age 9, that his father always had a plan. And that the plan always eventually worked. And that asking about it in the middle of the thinking face phase was about as useful. Nathaniel spent the morning applying for 3 more remote positions, emailing 2 former colleagues who owed him favors, and calculating, for the 4th time that month, How long the savings would last? The answer was 4 months. Maybe 5 if he didn't replace the bathroom faucet, which had been leaking since April. In the afternoon, he drove Cody to school late start, that day, star faculty thing. And on the way back stopped at a hardware store on Millbrook Avenue to price the faucet parts himself rather than pay a plumber. The store was quiet on weekday afternoons. He had a list on his phone. He found the aisle, found the part, stood in the plumbing section, doing the math on whether the repair was within his capability. Which it probably was if he watched 2 videos first. He was reaching for the shelf when he heard a voice from the next aisle over. Not words at first. Just a tone. The specific tired patience of someone explaining something for the 3rd or 4th time to a person who was not listening. Then the words came through. Sir, I understand. But the return policy is printed right on the receipt. I can't override it without a manager approval, and the manager won't be in until 4. Then another voice louder, the kind that expected volume to substitute for logic. I've been coming to this store for 20 years. 20 years. And you're going to stand here and tell me. Nathaniel did not intend to look. He had no standing in someone else's dispute, and more practically, he had no voice to offer if it escalated. But he rounded the corner of the aisle for a different part he needed. And that's when he saw them. The employee was young. Mid-20s at most, a woman with her dark hair pulled back in a hardware store vest, 2 sizes too large. Her name tag said Rennie. She was standing very straight, the way people stand when they're tired, but determined not to show it, holding a clipboard against her chest like a small shield. The customer in front of her was red-faced and gesturing. He wasn't touching her, but the air between them had the compressed feeling of something about to go wrong. Nathaniel stopped. He didn't plan what happened next. He took his phone from his pocket, opened his notes app, typed quickly, and held the screen up so Rennie could see it from where she stood. I'm an attorney. Do you need me to stay? She read it. Something in her face changed. Not relief exactly. More like the particular steadiness that comes from knowing you're not alone. She gave him a small nod. The customer noticed Nathaniel then. Looked at him, looked at the phone, opened his mouth, and for reasons that had more to do with Nathaniel's height and the flatness of his expression than anything else, seemed to recalculate. The bluster deflated slightly. He grabbed his receipt from the counter, muttered something, and left. Rennie exhaled slowly. Thank you, she said. Nathaniel typed, Are you all right? She read it and tilted her head slightly, the way people did when they were recalibrating. You don't talk? He shook his head. She thought about that for exactly 1 second and then said, Well, you showed up at the right time, so. You find everything okay? He held up the faucet part. That'll work, she said. Grab the washers in the yellow bin at the end, otherwise you'll be back tomorrow. He nodded. He got the washers. He paid and left. He thought about Rennie twice on the way home. Once because of the steadiness of her. And once because of how quickly she had adjusted to the absence of his voice, the way Cody did, the way the post office woman did, the way almost nobody did on the first meeting. He did not think it would be anything more than that. 3 days later, the pipe under the bathroom sink gave out entirely. Not just the faucet but the coupling behind the wall, which was beyond the 2 video fix he had prepared for. He drove back to Millbrook Hardware at 4 in the afternoon, because he needed a specific part and wasn't sure which one. Rennie was behind the service counter. She recognized him. Pipe got worse? He nodded. She came around the counter without being asked, and walked him to the plumbing aisle, asking questions and waiting for him to type the answers, which she read without impatience. She had clearly worked in this store long enough to know every part by instinct. She pulled 3 options off the shelf, compared them, explained the difference, and handed him the correct one. While they were standing there, she said, almost to herself, My dad used to do plumbing. I grew up watching him fix everything with a flashlight in his mouth and no instructions. A small pause. He passed last year. Nathaniel looked at her. Sorry, she said. I don't know why I said that. You didn't ask. He typed, You said it because it was true. She read it. Smiled, not the customer service kind. I guess so. He came back a 3rd time, a week later, for something he could have ordered online. He didn't examine that too closely. Rennie, it turned out, was 34 years old, and a single mother to a 6-year-old daughter named Bet. Short for Bertie, which was her grandmother's name, and yes, she knew it was old-fashioned, and yes, her daughter already had opinions about it. She worked full-time at the hardware store and took 2 evening courses online toward a paralegal certificate. She did this in the 2 hours between Bet's bedtime and her own, which meant she was usually running on 6 hours of sleep and the particular focused energy of someone with too much to do, and no margin for distraction. She had moved to Shreveport 3 years ago from a small town outside Baton Rouge after her marriage ended, which she described in the way people describe things that hurt too much to describe. Briefly, and then on to the next thing. She had no family nearby. She had a neighbor who watched Bet on Tuesday nights, and a good pediatrician, and a grocery store that did pickup now, which she said had genuinely improved her quality of life, more than any single thing in recent memory. She told him these things, in pieces, over several weeks, in the plumbing aisle or near the register when the store was quiet. She seemed to assume correctly that Nathaniel was not going to fill silence with small talk, which meant she filled it herself, and the arrangement suited both of them. What Nathaniel noticed, in the careful way he noticed things, was that Rennie never treated the phone as a barrier. She talked to him the way she might talk to anyone. Not slowly, not loudly, not with the slight performance that people sometimes added when they were being understanding. She just talked. And she read his replies with the same attention she gave anything else, like what he typed was simply what he was saying. He had not been talked to that way, by a new person, in 11 years. One afternoon in October, he came in during his lunch break and found her in the back aisle reorganizing the cabinet hardware, which had clearly been a project for a while, because there were bins everywhere, and she was cross-legged on the floor with a label maker. She looked up and said, without preamble, "Do you miss it?" He typed. "Miss what?" "Talking," she said, out loud. "Do you miss it?" He stood there for a moment. He had been asked versions of this before. By therapists, by his mother, by well-meaning friends in the early years who had since mostly drifted away. He always typed some version of sometimes because it was easier than the full answer, which was that missing it presupposed he believed it was still somewhere to be found, and for a long time he hadn't believed that. But he typed, "I miss what it felt like when words worked the way I meant them to." I don't know if that's the same thing. Rennie read it. "Yeah," she said. "I think I know what that means." And then she went back to the cabinet hardware, and the afternoon continued, and something shifted so quietly in Nathaniel that he almost didn't notice it. Almost. He started taking different routes home that passed Millbrook Avenue. He started eating lunch later, which happened to coincide with a quieter hour at the store. He found small household tasks that required parts. He was not fooling himself. He was a lawyer, and lawyers are professionally trained to know when an argument doesn't hold up. But he allowed it, the way you allow something that is doing no harm and possibly some good. Cody noticed. "You've been going to that hardware store a lot," he said one evening, without looking up from his homework. Nathaniel shrugged. "There's a lady there," Cody said, still not looking up. Nathaniel typed on his phone and slid it across the table. "She helps me find parts." Cody read it, looked up. "Does she know you used to be a lawyer?" Nathaniel nodded. "Does she treat you weird about it?" Nathaniel thought about this honestly and then shook his head. Cody looked at him for a moment in the steady, appraising way he had inherited from Karen. That still look, like he was tallying something internally. Then he went back to his homework. "Okay," he said. That was November. In December, two things happened. The first, Nathaniel got a message from a former colleague who had heard he was available. There was a firm in Dallas looking for a consultant on a labor case. Document heavy, no hearings required, fully remote. The rate was twice what he had been making before the work dried up. He said yes within the hour. The second thing happened on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days before Christmas. He was at the store, legitimately this time, for weather stripping. And Rennie was helping another customer. He waited. When she finished, she turned to him and before he could hold up his phone she said, "Can I ask you something weird?" He opened his notes app. Bet at school is doing a Christmas reading thing. Parents come in, read a story to the class. Every year I do it and every year I pick the wrong book and the kids are bored, and Bet P pretends she doesn't know me afterward. She said this lightly, but there was something underneath it. "I was wondering, she mentioned you. She's never met you, but she saw your picture on my phone and asked who you were and I said a friend and she said, 'Is he nice?' And I said yes and she said, 'Does he read good books?'" Rennie paused. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." Nathaniel typed, "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know. But I thought you probably did." She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to do it, I know you can't. I just thought if you had a recommendation, a book, that a 6-year-old class would actually like." He thought for a moment, then he typed, "I'll do it." She stared at him. "What?" "I'll come. I can't read aloud. But I can hold the book and you can read while I turn the pages. The kids will think it's a 2-person show. Tell Bet it's a performance." Rennie read it twice. "Nathaniel, you don't have to." "I know." He typed it fast before she could argue him out of it. "Which day?" The class was on a Wednesday morning 3 days before Christmas. Nathaniel wore a tie, which Cody had approved with a thumbs up. He chose the book. A picture book about a lighthouse keeper and a lost whale. which he knew from reading it to Cody when Cody was small, and which had one passage that always caught in the throat. He stood in front of 22 first graders holding the book open. Rennie stood beside him and read. He turned the pages. When the children laughed at the funny parts, he let himself laugh quietly. When Rennie read the part about the whale finding its way home, she stumbled slightly over the last line, and he glanced at her. And she was looking at the ceiling for a second, the way people do when they're deciding not to cry in a room full of children. Bet, in the third row, watched the whole thing with her grandmother's old name and her mother's serious eyes. At the end she raised her hand and said, "To no one in particular." He never talked, but I could tell what he was thinking. The teacher said, "Oh, he's happy," Bet said. "You can tell." Nathaniel looked at Bet. She was 6 years old and completely certain. The way children are certain about things before anyone teaches them to second-guess themselves. He realized, standing there in a first-grade classroom, 11 days before Christmas with a lighthouse book in his hands, that he had not cried in front of anyone since the first weeks after the accident. He had trained himself out of it. The way he had trained himself out of needing things, he couldn't have. He didn't cry then either. But something behind his sternum shifted, like a joint that had been locked too long, easing back into alignment. Something quiet and enormous. He drove home. He sat in the car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. That evening he texted Rennie. It took her a moment. Then, right about what? I was happy. 3 dots appeared, disappeared. Then good. January came. He took the Dallas case and started working regular hours again at the kitchen table. Cody doing homework across from him in the evenings. The house filling back up with something that felt like its own kind of steadiness. He saw Rennie for coffee on a Sunday. Just coffee. At a diner on Grant Street with corner booths and no particular ambience, which suited them both. She brought Bet because the neighbor wasn't available, and Bet sat between them and ate pancakes and asked Nathaniel approximately 47 questions, all of which he answered by typing on his phone while Bet read them aloud back to Rennie like she was performing a radio broadcast. He says his favorite color is green, Bet announced, not regular green, like early morning grass green. That's very specific, Rennie said. Bet looked at Nathaniel. Is that from something? Like a memory? He typed. My wife's garden. She grew tomatoes. Bet read this aloud without missing a beat. Then she thought about it and said, is that sad or happy? He looked at her. He thought about Karen's garden in July, the way she'd come inside with dirt on her knees and complain that the tomatoes weren't cooperating. He thought about Cody at age 3 pulling a tomato off the vine and trying to eat it like an apple. He typed, both. Bet nodded gravely. I feel like that about my hamster, she said. He died, but also he was really funny. Rennie laughed. Really laughed, head back, eyes closed for a second. It was the first time he had heard her laugh like that, and it sounded like something that had been waiting. He thought about what Rennie had said weeks ago. Daddy says miracles happen when people stop feeling alone. No. That had been a different story, a different child. That wasn't his. But the truth underneath it was the same. He had been alone in his silence for 11 years, not always physically, but in the way that mattered. No one on the other side of it. And then a woman in a hardware store vest had talked to him, like his silence was simply how he talked. And a 6-year-old had read his words aloud at a diner counter, like they were worth broadcasting. And somewhere in the unexamined accumulation of Small Tuesdays and plumbing parts and lighthouse books, the thing that had been locked had begun, slowly and without fanfare, to open. He didn't know what came next. He was a careful man, and careful men don't speculate far ahead when the present is uncertain. But that afternoon at the diner, watching Bet narrate his food order to a mildly bewildered server. He wants the eggs over medium and he says please. Even though he can't say it, I'm saying it for him. Nathaniel felt something he had not felt since before Route 9 and the silence and the long disciplined work of keeping his world small enough to survive. He felt, without qualification, that he was glad to be there. In the spring, something else happened. Something the doctors described carefully, and his therapist described cautiously, and Nathaniel himself did not describe at all, at first, because he was not sure he trusted it. In an early April session, during what should have been a routine breathing exercise, he produced a sound, not a word, not anything intelligible. Just a sound, low, rough, effortful, like a door opening on a hinge that had rusted through. His therapist went very still. Nathaniel sat with his hands on his knees and breathed. By June, there were fragments. Single syllables that came out wrong but came out. His throat felt the way a limb feels after a long cast comes off. Foreign, tender, unreliable. He didn't tell anyone outside the therapy room, not even Cody, because he was a lawyer and he knew better than to make promises before he was sure they would hold. He told Rennie on a Thursday evening, over text, after they had been trading messages for an hour about a problem with her lease, and whether her landlord was bluffing. I should tell you something. I've been having voice therapy for a while. It's moving. I don't know how far it goes. She replied immediately, Nathaniel, then, I didn't know that. Then, are you okay? He typed, I don't know yet, but I think maybe yes. The first time he said her name out loud, it was September in her kitchen, while she was arguing with a stuck jar lid. He had been trying to say something for 3 minutes. He could feel the word forming in the way he now recognized, the particular gathering of effort. And then she swore at the jar lid, in a way that surprised a laugh out of him. And the laugh came with sound, real sound, and writing, behind it, half-formed and rough, and barely audible. Rennie, she turned around, he said it again. Clearer this time. 2 syllables that had been locked for 11 years finally moving through air. Her eyes went wide. Then something in her face broke open in the best way. The way a knot goes slack when the right thread is pulled. She set the jar down on the counter and looked at him. And he stood there in her kitchen with his voice coming back from wherever it had been. And neither of them said anything else for a long moment, which was all right. Because some silences are not absence. They are arrival. Cody found out the way he found out most things. By paying attention. Nathaniel read him a story that November, the first time since before the accident, sitting at the edge of Cody's bed with a book he'd had since before Cody was born. His voice was still ragged in places, still caught on certain words. It didn't matter. Cody lay very still and listened, and at the end he said nothing, just rolled over and closed his eyes, and Nathaniel sat there for a minute in the dark. Then Cody said almost asleep, I knew you had it in there. Nathaniel said, very quietly, I know you did. The words came out whole. There is a particular kind of courage that gets no headlines. Not the kind that happens in a single moment that everyone sees, but the kind that happens every day, alone, in the years when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. Nathaniel Crane had practiced that courage for 11 years in a narrow house on Prescott Lane. Building a life one careful day at a time, with nothing but his son, and his discipline, and his silence. What he didn't know, in all those years of building, was that he wasn't building a wall. He was building a foundation. And foundations don't need to be seen, they just need to hold. Sometimes the people who unlock us don't arrive with instructions or explanations. Sometimes they arrive with a clipboard and a hardware vest, talking to us like we're already whole, waiting without impatience for whatever we have to say. And sometimes that is exactly enough.